This lesson is on applying properties. We've learned some properties and now we'll apply those. Before we begin, let's review the properties. We have a commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. We have the associative property of addition and the associative property of multiplication. We have the identity property of addition and the identity property of multiplication. We have the inverse property of addition and the inverse property of multiplication. We have the multiplicative property of 0, so that would be a property of multiplication. We also learned the distributive property, where we took a number and multiplied it by each number inside the parentheses. So in this instance, we took 5 times 3 plus 5 times 2. We took the number outside the parentheses and distributed it or multiplied it by each number inside the parentheses. Another property we'll be using today is called substitution. An example of substitution is when we have the numbers 4 plus 1 and we substitute it, we add those together and we substitute 4 plus 1 and write 5. So let's apply the properties. So in the first instance, we have negative 3 plus the quantity 6 plus 3, and that's given. We then have negative 3 plus the quantity 3 plus 6. And the difference between the first step and the second step is that we change the order of the numbers. So that would be an example of the commutative property of addition. In the next step, we have the quantity negative 3 plus 3 plus 6. So from step 2 to 3, we kept the order, but we changed the grouping. So that's an example of the associative property of addition. Okay, the next step, we took negative 3 plus 3 and wrote 0. So we have the negative 3 and the opposite, which is 3. So that's an example of the inverse property of addition. And in the final step, we have 0 plus 6 and got 6. That's an example of the identity property of addition. The next example is the quantity 1/3 times 2 times 3. So we're using multiplication. This is our given. So go ahead and identify the properties of multiplication we used. Okay, from step 1 to 2, we have the quantity 2 times 1/3 times 3. So the difference there is we changed the order. So that's an example of the commutative property of multiplication. In the next step, we have 2 times the quantity 1/3 times 3. So we kept the order, we just changed the grouping. So that's an example of the associative property of multiplication. In the next step, we took 1/3 times 3. So we took the reciprocal, so that is the inverse property of multiplication. And in the last step, we took 2 times 1, which is an example of the identity property of multiplication. Okay, number 3, go ahead and try number 3. We have 5 times the quantity 1/5 plus 1. So go ahead and identify the properties for each step. So in step 2, we removed the parentheses and we multiplied by 5 by each number inside the parentheses. So that's an example of the distributive property. In the next step, we took 5 times 1/5 and we have 1. So we took the reciprocal, So that's the inverse property of multiplication. In the next step, we took 5 times 1 and got 5. So that's an example of the identity property of multiplication. And in our last step, we have 1 plus 5, and we replaced it or substituted it with a 6. So that's called substitution. So go ahead and create your own proof and use the above problems as a guide.